The following program sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts.
About money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth, and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared on the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
It's Thursday afternoon, or Friday, depending upon when you've tuned in, or it could be Saturday evening. We're on all three times. So welcome to the program. We're going to be talking about money. But before I talk about some of the current things going on, I want to tell you about something that's coming up on March 25th. It's called Play It Forward 7. It's a remarkable time. It's a cause that raises money. It's a very good cause for raising money and raises money for a good cause. It's a very, very fun evening. There's no auction. It's just a fun time. It's going to be at the Triple Door from 5 until 9 or 10 or whenever it ends. A couple hours of music being played. The dinner's going to be there. But it's called Play It Forward. It raises money for high school music programs. It raises money for those programs where there's been a shortfall, when you have teachers buying instruments out of their own salary, going from garage sale to garage sale to buy instruments because the school doesn't have money, the parents don't have money. Places like Omat, Ritzville, Yelm, Ferndale, some of those places where the programs are in need, and this is something that raises money to support those programs. Giving grants. Last year we gave $80,000 in grants, small grants. They're not huge, overwhelming grants. They're grants of $5,000, $7,000, $1,200, but it's something which is very positive. It's called Play It Forward. If you have any questions, send me an email, mike@adamsfinancialconcepts.com, or call Adams Financial Concepts, 206-903-1019. This year, by the way, I should mention, it's going to be about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's going to celebrate Alan White, who grew up in the UK, who has been the drummer for Yes for over 30 years. If you know the song Imagine, John Lennon's song, he was the one that was the drummer in that. He was the drummer in Lennon's Instant Karma. He's been around some time. In my opinion, he may be the greatest rock and roll drummer of all time. And he's being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in April. So you'll get to meet Alan White prior to his induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Plus, there'll be a couple people from Heart, the guitarist, the drum player from Heart. They're already in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And above all, it's just a really great, fun evening raising money for a great cause. So give me a call. Send me an email. Tickets are $250 or $500, and there's benefits that go with both of those ticket prices. So anyway, come join us. It's going to be a great time. So I want to talk about what's going on in Washington and some of the potential about investments. With all the news going on now, with the Mike Flynn resignation, with the reach out to Russia, with the press conferences that have been going on, with all the information, whether you're for Trump or against Trump, whether you believe what happened or don't believe what happened, if you believe it's the media or if you believe it's the intelligence, whatever you believe, that's taking a lot of the news. But some of the important things are beginning to move through the administration that you should really be aware of. They're flying under the radar. And I want to talk about that today because there's a new proposal out from this administration. They're beginning to test it. They're beginning to look at it. You know, during the campaign, Donald Trump, when he was running, talked about imposing tariffs on Chinese products of 35 or 40%, 45%. The reason was because we're running a deficit in our balance of trade with China. And he claimed that they needed to, or that they were manipulating their currency. And so he wanted to impose tariffs. That was what went on during the campaign. But as things have come together with the Commerce Secretary, with the Treasury Secretary, they're proposing something slightly different, actually significantly different. But in my opinion, could have the same devastating effect. The idea is for the Commerce Secretary, the U.S. Commerce, the Secretary of the U.S. Commerce Department, to say that countries are practicing currency manipulation. They apply it to the entire world. Any country that's doing currency manipulation is subject to regulation, is subject to the United States imposing anti-subsidy tariffs. It doesn't single out China, doesn't single out any country. It says any country in the world where they think that there may be currency manipulation. Companies can come forward and say, I think it's because of currency manipulation that my product isn't selling. And China has an unfair advantage, or Argentina has an unfair advantage, or Nigeria has an unfair advantage because of their currency, and my product is more expensive, and so the U.S. should put a tariff on those products. It's happened before, but usually it's a very straightforward and very obvious thing. Happened with steel. China overproduced steel, had 600 metric tons per year extra capacity over and above what the world was absorbing, and a number of countries put tariffs on it. In the UK, they actually shut down some steel mills because of China subsidizing their steel production. But this opens up the thing so that, or opens up the regulations so almost any company can say China's undercutting our products, and so they should have a tariff put on their product. You know, the idea of saying it's not particular to China is similar to the immigration ban that was just passed, saying it's not a ban against Muslims or based on religion. The idea is to say, in this case, it's not targeted to China, it's not targeted to Mexico, it's not targeted to any specific country. It could be any country, Malaysia, could be Italy, could be Greece, whatever. But the reality is, it's very specific in what it's targeting. And it allows the U.S. Commerce Department to impose tariffs. It's like we're coming into the middle of this story. So I think it's important to think about what's going on, where it's going on, and what the impact has been. You know, if you go back to the 1920s and 1930s, people talk about this all the time, the Smoot-Hawley Act. In the 1930s, the early 1930s, unemployment had reached 30%. Imported goods were coming into the United States and competing with American goods, and American companies wanted tariffs to make their goods more competitive. They were getting a lot of cheap imports coming in, and the American companies wanted to impose tariffs so that they could raise their prices or so that they could sell their products at a cheaper price than the imports. And Hoover campaigned on the idea of raising tariffs on agricultural imports, but lower tariffs on industrial goods. So much more of a tariff on agricultural goods, but even on industrial goods, they wanted to have a tariff. And Willis Hawley, a congressman from Oregon, put together the House version, and Reed Smoot, who was a senator from Utah, was the other person that put together the Senate bill. And in May of 1930, 1,028 economists petitioned against the Smoot-Hawley Act, said that it was going to be a disaster. Henry Ford came out and spent an evening at the White House, said it was going to be an economic stupidity. J.P. Morgan's CEO, Thomas Lamont, almost went to his knees saying it was asinine to pass the bill, but it did pass. And even before that bill passed, other countries reacted. Canada put a 30% tariff on all imports into Canada. Everything we exported to Canada faced a 30% tariff. Britain and Germany put tariffs on our goods. All around the world, countries were moving and putting tariffs. The impact was that U.S. exports fell 61%. We were exporting $5.4 billion, which was a big, big number in the 1930s. $5.4 billion, that fell to $2.1 billion. Imports also fell because we had tariffs. But the impact was a 50% decline in GDP and a 20% drop in U.S. production, and worldwide trade dropped 66%. That's the impact of what a trade war does. And so as people talk about this whole situation with putting currency manipulation into effect, they're talking about possibly controlling that with a trade war. Don't go away. We'll talk about more coming up.
About Money with Mike Adams will resume in a moment on Business Radio 1300 KKOL. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Did you know the 20-year annualized S&P return was 8.19%, while the 20-year annualized return for the average equity mutual fund investor was just 4.67%? That's a gap of 3.52%. It doesn't sound like much now, but it could mean the difference between retiring in comfort and running out of money. For some seniors, a gap that large could cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars and cut their retirement short. Don't run out of money. Call Mike Adams of Adams Financial Concepts today, 206-903-1019, and learn more about how you can, 1, create wealth for retirement, and 2, protect yourself from running out of money. Adams Financial Concepts specializes in creating and maintaining wealth. Call today, 206-903-1019, or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. KKOL.com.
We're back with more About Money. For details on what you hear on today's show, visit adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Now, here again is Mike Adams.
So, I have a really important guest on the program today, so you want to hear what she has to say. And, you know, we've got so much to do, and there is so much going on in the world. We've got such a focus on what's happening with Flynn. We've got such a focus on Russia and the administration and the press conference today and all those things. Whether you like Trump or dislike Trump, whether you like what's happening or dislike what's happening, what is concerning to me is what's going on underneath all this. And I started to talk about the new rules that the Commerce Department's about to pass about currency manipulation. Currency is something that's traded worldwide. Prior to the end of World War II, even in the early days of the World War II, realizing that we were coming out of a worldwide Great Depression, you had a meeting of leaders, primarily the UK and the US. John Maynard Keynes from the UK and Harry Dexter of the US. And as the war came to an end, they were concerned about how to stop going into another depression and how to put the worldwide economy on a growth scale, a rebuilding scale, on how to make things flow and how to keep currencies going. Prior to that time, the currency of choice rotated between the German mark, the French franc, and the pound sterling of the UK. there weren't that many things that were traded in dollars. But coming out of World War II, they gathered together what was then called the G5 because they brought in France, Germany, and Japan with the UK and the US. And they started to talk about what needed to be done to rebuild the world, really rebuild the world. That led to a time in 1944 or 1945 of a meeting of 44 countries, representatives from 44 countries at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. It was a conference that lasted 22 days, and from that came the International Monetary Fund, the General World Bank, the GATT reforms, and it put the world economy on a basis that countries could complete trade. Smoot-Hawley went away. Those things, the free trade began to return instead of the tariffs. And over the years, of course, the G5 has expanded to G20, including China and Brazil, Russia, Argentina. It's expanded, and the dollar's dominance has not really been questioned. The dollar is the most traded currency in the world. Most products are traded in dollars. And even as we went through this period of time with the Great Recession, people questioned whether the dollar should be the currency. You need a currency which has a widespread trading, a wide reserve. The Swiss franc is limited. Other currencies were limited. When we put the sanctions on Russia, they tried to put the ruble, and the Chinese currency is the currency of choice, but the dollar remains the currency. And what really determines the value of a currency is not what a government wants to do, but how it trades in the world market. It depends upon the economy, the health of the economy. It's pretty logical, isn't it? Wouldn't you pay more for a currency that was issued by a strong nation than the currency of a weak nation that was going to be overturned? Think about the currency from India, which they just released a brand new currency and changed. Or think about the lira in Turkey. When I was in Turkey, which I think was 1998, it was like a little over 1 million lira to the dollar. That's how much things have changed, because the Turkish economy compared to the U.S. economy had changed. So what we see and what they talk about in terms of China with their currency, they tried to keep and hold it pegged to the dollar, but that's really difficult for a country to do. China, in trying to manipulate their currency, and they have tried to manipulate their currency, has spent over $1 trillion of their reserves trying to hold up the currency. There is so much currency and so much wealth floating through the world that countries that try to support their currency end up using up their reserves. The way you support your currency is to buy it in the open market, and if anybody's willing to sell it, you buy it back. But what you have plenty of people that are willing to short a currency. Think of the small country of Georgia that has the dolari. It's the Georgian lari. It's called the dolari. And the dolari, they decided, should be pegged at 1-to-1 with the dollar, because it was a function of the dollar that was coming out of the time when the Soviet Union broke apart and you had Georgia as a separate country. They tried to peg the dolari to the dollar, and what happened is they used up, they had, I think it was something like $300 billion or $400 billion worth of dollars in reserve. They used up $200 to $300 billion trying to support the dolari against the dollar. And what happened? Traded 2-to-1 eventually. That's how currencies float. I can remember in the early 2000s when Europe looked like it was stronger than the United States, that the French franc, or the euro, actually, was above the the U.S. dollar, it was 120 U.S. dollars to $100 100 euros. That is almost reversed now. But back in those days, Airbus was filing a complaint with the World Trade Organization saying that Boeing was getting subsidized because the American currency was less than the European currency. That made U.S. planes made by Boeing cheaper than Airbus planes. So the currency values are going to change. And when a currency changes, as the currency value drops, what you're importing, if your currency is stronger, what you're importing will become cheaper and cheaper, and what you're exporting will become more expensive. And so it tends to hurt your balance of trade problems. It's one of the things which we'll talk about in a future program, because if we pass tax reform, the dollar's not going to get weaker. It's going to get stronger, and it's going to have those impacts. All I'm trying to say is there are things going on which investors need to be aware of. Those things can impact what's happening. It's going to impact certain companies. If you look at who's going to be hurt if we go into a trade war, if you look at China and the U.S., if we get into a trade war with China, it's the U.S. which is going to be hurt more than China. Think about it. What some of their big manufacturing products are laptop computers and cell phones. If you look at just the cell phone market, Chinese people buy 131 million cell phones a year. In the U.S., we buy 110 million. Most of the products being manufactured in China are going to India, into Malaysia, into Australia. They're going into different parts of the world than the U.S. If we impose tariffs, it makes their products more expensive. And you can think of companies like a Walmart, which buys products from China, and the impact that's going to have. That's not a positive impact for the average American person who buys. So it's something to be aware of, in terms of where you're placing your money and investing your money. It's going to have an impact. And while all the publicity seems to be about the Flynn, the Russia, there's things that are going on with the administration that can impact where your investments are and where your investment money needs to be. Changes need to happen. That's important to do. Anyway, that wraps that up. I've got more coming in a later part of the program when we're going to talk about healthcare, but I have a very interesting guest today. Has a fascinating story, has an important story, a really, really important story. So you want to hear what she has to say? It's Jamie Hills of New Care Concepts. Welcome to the program, Jamie.
Thank you.
So why don't we start with your background, which leads into New Care Concepts anyway.
Well, I'm an RN, and I have been an RN for nearly 40 years. And back in the 80s, I was privileged enough to work with one of the first children to come home from the hospital on a new program for children on life support systems living at home. And from that beginning, I was able to start New Care in 1985, which was a way of taking care of children at home on life support systems.
So prior to that, children had been kept in the hospital?
Yes.
Until they passed away?
Yes. Yes, and this was really the issue of dollars and technology colliding. We were keeping children, especially premature children, alive longer in hospitals, and the idea was to get the children home so they could die at home. Well, that didn't happen. That first little boy I worked with, who had a prognosis of 6 weeks to 2 months to live, lived 20 years. Home care was very successful. We got the children out over the years more quickly than we had. They no longer stayed in for years. And it's been extremely successful. And of course, the greatest success is when you graduate a child and take the nurses out of the home and turn that child back over to their family. And we're no longer there.
It's an incredible story. We're going to get to that story after the commercial break, and we are coming to a commercial break, because of all the things that I've had on my program, I think this is one of the most caring, most sensitive. I don't know, sensitive is the wrong word to use, but it's one of the most moving stories, I think, of anyone on the program. So don't go away. We'll be right back after this commercial break.
More About Money coming up with Mike Adams on Business Radio 1300 KKOL. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Creating and maintaining wealth has been the specialty of Adams Financial Concepts for over 20 years. Every portfolio managed by Adams Financial Concepts is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. The client's interest always comes first in portfolio decisions. Call Mike Adams today at 206-903-1019 or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com to check out their AFC performance. They welcome your review. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Now we return to About Money. There's more information waiting for you at adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here again is your host, Mike Adams.
So I'm here with Jamie Hillis. We're talking about, she is from New Care Concepts, and we started to talk about her company and her program. I want to go back to that first child that, was released from the hospital, expected to live six weeks to 2 months.
Yes.
So what was the difference? If the child had stayed in the hospital, the child would have probably died in 6 weeks?
I think that child had been in the hospital for 2.5 years, and he had a neurological disease of unknown origin. The hospital is a wonderful place for acute situations. It's not a great place for a chronic situation or a place for a child to live or grow up. This little boy had a loving family, a large loving family, wanted him to come home. They'd been told he wouldn't live long. His prognosis was not good. And in the late 70s, the early 80s, Ronald Reagan made Medicaid available to the states to use as home care if they could provide the same quality of care in the home as they could in the hospital at a lesser price. And Washington was one of the first states to adopt that rule to use their Medicaid dollars. This was a time when insurance would max out at about $1 million, and even though hospital stays in the 80s were about $30,000 a month, you can see that $1 million wasn't going to last a long time. So Medicaid then became the alternate insurance, so to speak, after the insurance had run out, or you had folks who had no insurance and Medicaid was the coverage. So Washington adopted that plan.
And it was under Medicaid that the child came out of the hospital.
Yes.
And had brothers and sisters. And so what was the home situation?
He had lived with his grandmother, his mother, his aunt, and his 2 siblings, and an uncle.
All in the same home?
All in the same home, yes. Very small home, but they made it work.
And so when you have a child like this that comes home and you have nursing care, I assume that the care is 24 hours a day.
Not always. It's very rare that it's 24 hours a day. 16 hours a day is usually the maximum time that we provide. We do have 24-hour-a-day cases. However, we're always hoping that family can be involved and that there's time without nurses in the home and that there's time for family time without strangers being there. Sometimes that works depending on the family situation. If parents are working, then there may be more hours that are needed in any situation. But with that little boy, he had 16 hours a day and then was able to, after the first few months after he was home and we realized he was not going to pass away, he started in school the next year. So we were able to take him to school. And there was a specific school at that time called Wilson Pacific for children with disabilities or who are differently abled. And that's where we started taking Michael.
So, and did this continue then? He continued through high school?
Yes, he did.
And is there now, you said at that time there was a school. Do those schools exist today?
No, No, the children are in regular elementary or middle schools or high schools. And that is a wonderful place for people to be that are, are functioning. Sometimes it's disruptive with children who don't get past 3 or 4 years old mentality.
So this was the first child.
Yes.
But it's not the only one.
No.
So tell me about your program and what New Care Concepts does.
Well, what we do is we provide the nurses to take care of the children in their home. And our program started pretty simply. There were 8 of us, including myself, and I had rented a friend's basement, and that was our office. I had a desk and a portable typewriter and a cat named Frank, and that was how New Care started. Our first benefit was health care. It seemed right if we were providing health care that our 8 employees would have health care, but those days it was $74 a month for medical and dental through King County Medical. In August, that was March of 1985, and in August of 85, I moved to Ballard and moved to a very small office that was about 12 by 12, and that seemed really exciting. It was a real office. And from there, I've never left that building, although that 12 by 12 office is now about 6,000 square feet.
Wow.
And we have over 100 employees.
Wow.
So our program is to provide trained nurses to do medically intensive home care. And when I first got into this, the training was very minimal, not very much. Families did a lot of the training. In our company, before a nurse can work in the field, they need to go through a training class for a trach and for ventilators and assessment classes. And we've also put in a training class for a certificate for a pediatric nurse certificate, registered pediatric nurse certificate for the home-based nurse, and that's a 2-year program.
So it's 2 years before they actually get into the home.
No, excuse me. Getting that pediatric certificate takes 2 years, but you're working the entire time that you're getting that in the home.
So describe what happens. You have a child that is, has problems.
Yes. Usually it's children that are born very premature, born with a congenital condition. And we will get a call from a discharge planner about discharge planners at the various hospitals that we might work with. Families certainly have choices, and there's more than one company that provides medically intensive home health care. So we meet with the families, and then there's a lot of equipment, obviously, that goes home. There's a lot of training that has to be done. If a child is coming out of the hospital, we want to do the training in the hospital with a group of nurses that are going home with that child first, and then be able to get that child home with their parents and with their nursing staff.
So in the case of most children, how long do the nurses stay? Not during the day, but how many years?
How many years? It depends on the condition of the child. If the child is premature and it's has no other problems than the prematurity and growing into the lungs, we've been in and out in as short a time as 2 years. And that's a very short time to come in. When you're talking about children that are born weighing a pound, for them then to grow into their lungs, it will take up to 2 years. We go through first we get home, then as we progress and the child stabilizes, and we know we're working with other therapies with this child, and then we start a weaning process. Of course, this all goes on through only with doctor's orders and respiratory therapist orders, but then we start a weaning process of weaning them off the trach as we can find out that they can breathe on their own.
So when you say grow into their lungs,
yes.
What does that mean?
Well, when a child is born very premature, they don't have enough surfactant and leptin ratio to keep those lungs breathing on their own, so they're on mechanical ventilation. And those lungs just need time to develop and mature, and that will take some children longer than others, but that's what we mean when we say they need to grow into their lungs.
Okay. So as the child progresses through this process, and as little time as 2 years, but sometimes longer.
Yes.
Does the nursing continue to be 16 hours a day, or does it begin to reduce time?
Our hope is always that it will reduce time, and it depends on the family situation, on how much care they can provide. If you have two parents working outside the home, sometimes it can be more difficult, and you keep that 16 hours in there. But as we approach that graduation date, we try to wean that down so parents are used to taking all of this care. And usually, if a trait comes out, the child has about a month of nursing care that either the state or the insurance companies approve, so the parents can work through that transition, still with help there. But believe me, the parents are very well trained to take care of their own children. Parents know more about their children than any. Doesn't matter how many initials you have after your name, but they are the experts with their own children.
Yeah.
So we always feel very comfortable by the time they graduate.
And are most of these programs paid by Medicare then? Or
No,
Medicaid?
Medicare does not pay for any of these programs. They're paid for by insurance companies. And in Washington, we've been very fortunate that we have had this program for so long that if you're a Washington-funded insurance company, then this is something that you will provide, should it be necessary. And we've had a lot of luck with the insurance commissioner working on our behalf for children with medically intensive home health care needs. So the insurance companies are now paying for that. The Affordable Care Act has been a wonderful asset to our clients. They no longer have limits on their insurance, and they no longer have to go on Medicaid because it ends.
Awesome. We're coming to the end of our time, but it's such a tremendous program and such a great service that you do.
Thank you.
And it must be very rewarding as well.
It's been a wonderful career, and I'm very proud of it. And I'm very proud of the people who've worked with me.
Awesome. What a great story.
Thank you.
Thanks for being on the radio.
Thanks
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Mike.
We're coming to commercial break. Don't go away, because I will come back and talk about health care.
Stay tuned. About Money returns in a moment with Mike Adams here on Business Radio 1300 KKOL. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
How do you picture retirement? House on the beach, small farm in the country, traveling the world with your spouse. The one thing you don't picture is running out of money. Retirement dreams are shattered all too often by poor investment choices, sending many retirees back to work. If you think the job market is tough now, try entering it after you've retired. Don't run out of money. Start planning now. Call Mike Adams of Adams Financial Concepts today at 206-903-1019 and learn more about how you can create wealth for retirement and probably, most importantly, protect yourself from running out of money. Adams Financial Concepts specializes in creating and maintaining wealth. Call today, 206-903-1019 or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
About Money continues. Remember the website adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So welcome back to the program. I want to talk about healthcare. It's of all the things that happened during the Obama administration, Obamacare became almost the most controversial, or was the most controversial. And now there's all this talk of repealing Obamacare and replacing it. We're not exactly sure how it's going to be replaced. I've talked a few times before about some of the ideas of replacing it, but it's again in the news about replacing Obamacare and talking about where things are. Up until the 1960s, we didn't have health care. Some people feel that everyone should have a right to health care. Well, it's been a long, slow process, and yet it's also very, very critical. When you look at our GDP, healthcare accounts for almost 20% of our GDP. Compare that to our military spending. Military spending is 4%. Healthcare is 5 times what military spending is. It's a huge amount. Small increases in healthcare have a significant impact on our GDP. Back when Medicare was passed, prior to passing Medicare, 49% of the people over 65 had no coverage whatsoever. 30% of those people over 65 were living below the poverty line. Significant amount of that due to medical problems. I can remember my own father when he was getting ready to retire at the age of 62 or 60, was thinking 62, 65. One of the options was a 5-year annuity because most people didn't live 5 years beyond retirement. The average time of or life expectancy of those days, if you reached retirement age, you didn't live a lot longer. You didn't have Medicare. You didn't have insurance to carry through. 49% of the people had no coverage at all. Half the country over 65 had no coverage. You know, the idea was to finance it through a payroll tax and build a fund, and we're now running a deficit. In 2010, there was $486 billion in revenue, $536 billion in benefits going out. Actually, $516 billion in benefits and $20 billion in administering the program. But it's a war of words, and a lot of it is about Obamacare this, Obamacare that. It's not really addressing all the issues. If you look at where we are as a nation, we're spending $2.6 trillion, and probably my numbers are a couple years old. It could be closer to $3 trillion now on health care. Over $8,000 per capita. And again, my numbers could be old. It could be closer to $9,000 per person spent. We're spending twice what the next nation spends. And yet, when you look at the results, they're not that great. You know, we're spending over 10 times on healthcare what we spent in the early 80s. The cost per person today is more than 10 times what it was in the 1980s. And yet our infant mortality rate is higher than any other industrialized nation. You know, you would think we would be best at that. Instead, we're the worst. Not the worst in the world, but of any industrialized country. The life expectancy, you know, if you look at the life expectancy, for anyone turning 65, it's increasing 3 months a year in the U.S. But you know what? We're only 42nd in the world. 41 other nations have life expectancies longer than the United States. That's something, both of those statistics are something that has changed. In terms of life expectancy at birth, 49 other countries have a better life expectancy at birth than we do. There was a picture of Time magazine showing a baby on the cover and saying, the baby has probably been born who will live to age 150. You know, we're living longer, and yet for all that, we don't stack up. We spend twice as much as any other nation, and yet we don't really come close. And the expenditures are growing. Prior to the Obamacare Act, we were seeing healthcare expenditures growing at 6.3% per year. You know, being a mathematician, I sat down and I figured out what that would do to our economy. And I figured that by, I've forgotten the year. By by 2045 or 2048, 98% of the budget of our GDP would be going to healthcare. That was the rate at which healthcare expenditures were growing prior to the Affordable Care Act, prior to Obamacare. Now, recently we've seen Obamacare premiums go up, but that's been a recent event. And when Obamacare was first passed, there were also a flurry of premium increases. And if you remember at that time, a lot of the insurance companies had to pay back the premiums because Obamacare made it a rule that, or a regulation, that 85% of the insurance premiums coming in had to be paid out in benefits. Prior to that, there was no regulation as to how much they could pay out in benefits. They could go off and do trips to the Mediterranean. They could go off and do all sorts of things as a company. They didn't have anything that said they had to pay out 85% or 75% or 50%. It was up to the individual insurance companies. That was where we were. And now as we come to this time, and we're talking about doing away with Obamacare or changing Obamacare, we're facing some real issues. Issue number one, it's been promised that everyone will have insurance, but it doesn't say what kind of insurance. The issue is if you continue without the limits on medical care. When Jamie Hills was here on the program, she talked about the limit before was $1 million per year. If you have no limit on medical care, you need healthy young people who are not sick to offset that. That was the concept behind the individual mandate. If you do away with the mandate and you don't have the healthy people come into the system, you have some really big issues on medical expenses. There's some big questions to cover, big questions that have to be dealt with. The best thing, in my opinion, is to make some modifications and tweaks to Obamacare, but to continue it. I don't see that we're going to come up with a better replacement unless we just make some changes. And perhaps that's the reason why the Republicans really haven't had a replacement they can say we're going to repeal and replace. Anyway, that wraps it up for today. Have a very good weekend. I will be back next week. And think about, play it forward. Coming up at the Triple Door March 25th. Send me an email, call, or make a call 206-903-1019. And have a great weekend.
You've been listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you want Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared on the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again for more About Money with Mike Adams here on Business Radio 1300 KKOL.
The preceding program was sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Creating and maintaining wealth has been the specialty of Adams Financial Concepts for over 20 years. Every portfolio managed by Adams Financial Concepts is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. The client's interest always comes first in portfolio decisions. Call Mike Adams today at 206-903-1019 or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com to check out their AFC performance. They welcome your review. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
When roll was called at the Phil's Gang meeting at noon, were you present and accounted for? Yeah, well, catch the replay of Phil Grandy at 9.
The following program